Go live. Let's send this guy.
By the way, do you anticipate, you don't know how many people will be on live
No clue. And there's a lot of people who watch,
for a while?
yeah, on YouTube without actually coming into the app. But I'll invite everyone into the app once we start.
Okay, sure.
So send that message. I think technically we have started, and people are watching me talk about starting. Let me pull up all my stuff here. All right. Hey, Diane.
Hello, Corey.
It is so good to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, I'm so excited. I've been wanting to do a show with you for so long now. And, just recently we've been able to connect and really make it happen. So I am super stoked for this. And I think our audience is going to love this. And honestly, I just, I really missed you. We had so many awesome experiences together just over the last 15 years of the Integral project in general. Yeah. So many events and so much content and conversations and all that. And it's just really, really nice to sort of, sit with you again. And
I'm really happy to be here. It's great to connect with you too. It's really great to see you.
So I figured what we would do is we would sort of talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, sure.
So we've got this show. Mm-hmm. It's on Integral Live. We're going to be doing it once a month.
Yes.
I think we're looking at the last Saturday of the month.
Okay.
I think is what we planned on doing. And, and as of right now, I think for both of us, what this show is going to be is a little bit unformed. So it's going to be interesting to see sort of how this congeals as we go. But we were talking about, we sent several emails back and forth talking about, geez, what should we call this thing? Mm-hmm. And I came up with sort of the tongue-in-cheek idea of integral justice warrior.
Yeah, you did. Yes.
But, yeah, I thought it was fun. What do you think of that title?
Well, I think it's interesting for me, just in the sense that my two main endeavors in what I teach. One is mediation, which is basically unbiased. I would say meditation, which is unbiased, as Ken likes to say, unqualified, unconditioned awareness without identity at all. And then mediation, I'm always kind of in between, trying to hold not just a neutral space, but to take both sides very fully. But when we talk about being a warrior, we're talking about actually standing for a perspective in a way that's both very skilled and very sustained over time. So for me, it's just a slightly different emphasis than where I've been before. And I like the idea of exploring it. I mean, it's sort of natural in a way. I think the people that know me understand that I'm a bit of a fighting spirit. So I do have sort of a natural warrior kind of energy. And a lot of my work as a meditator and mediator in a certain way has been to contradict that part of myself. So the question is, what does it mean to be a warrior in a way that's not pejorative? Lots of times or social justice warriors used pejoratively, sort of as a put down for people who care about values like civil rights and feminism and whatnot.
Right.
But, in this case, what does it mean to actually take a stand and privilege a perspective and be willing to sustain that position for a long period of time for a very particular set of values and set of reasons? So that's kind of how I understand it.
Yeah, no, I think it's well said. And I think that, as you say, social justice warrior is often used sort of pejoratively to talk, to describe anyone who really is coming from any set of progressive values at all, whether, feminism and all that. But I think it can be, somewhat more accurately used to describe sort of, what seems to be an increasingly reactionary wing of the left.
Yes.
And, this is sort of people who tend to be very, almost addicted in a certain kind of way to outrage. And, I think really the issue that a lot of people have with social justice warriors, SJWs, whatever, is that, they're really using social justice causes as a way to, almost prop up their own ego and sort of increase their social currency, right? Without really coming from a place of necessarily, conviction or passion or.
Yeah, well, at its very worst, they become oppressive and dominating in the very way that they're standing against.
Totally, yeah. They're using like progressive sounding language, right? But they're kind of enacting it in very rigid and dogmatic ways, and in ways that it's almost like this is sort of the new conservatism in a certain kind of way. There's an almost puritanical kind of taint to some of it.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think this conversation is important because, you, Diane, I see you as someone who is a genuine social justice warrior. I mean, in the most absolute positive sense.
Hmm.
It seems to me in a lot of ways you have bent your life and your practice and your mastery
Hmm.
around pursuing and protecting various forms of justice, social justice, individual justice. It seems like, all of this experience as a mediator, as a facilitator, as an integral teacher, as a Zen master, all of this, I think, makes you really sort of uniquely qualified as, not just as a social commentator, but
Hmm.
as, a real leader who I think can help sort of illuminate the path out of, this craziness, and, really a teacher who can, help us sort of discern, that really important difference between being woke and
Hmm.
being awake.
Aha, very good.
So,
Yeah.
integral
Yeah,
justice
good.
warrior.
Yeah, there you have it. Um, yeah, let me just say in relationship to what you just said, thank you. And I also feel sort of greatly humbled by your description. And I feel particularly contemplating as you do, Ken, and the website does, all these tremendously important issues. There's a lot to get our heads around, so to speak. And it's a little bit of an impossibility. So the question is, how do we clarify our values? How do we challenge our own moral compass? How do we, see ourselves in relationship to others, to a community of practice, to evolution itself? And where are we taking a stand? I mean,
Mhm.
that's really the question. If, in terms of this framing, is where are we taking a stand and why?
Yeah.
And is it legitimate? And how long can that stand be sustained? How much integrity does it take to maintain that? So
Yeah.
those are good questions. I haven't considered them very well, so hence the humility.
And that's why we're doing the show. We'll
Yeah,
consider it real
exactly.
time. And I love that, I love how you phrased it as standing up. I oftentimes say, the story of the Buddha is the story of a man who sat and sat and sat
You
and
sat
sat
down. Yes.
until it was time to stand up.
Yes.
And then he stood up.
Very good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
not too shabby. Well, and the other thing I want to talk about, Diane, is just how this show I think fits into so much of the other stuff that we've been trying to do here at Integral Life.
Yes.
So I've been trying to spin up all these shows with people like you, with Beena Sharma. We've got a new show coming out about integrating polarities.
Great.
Got a show with Dr. Keith where we sort of explore the psychological territory
Hmm.
month by month. We've got obviously the show with Ken, who's still, kind of holding the big framework for everyone, and a show with Ryan Oakey where we're focusing on how to more fully inhabit the territory of our lives
Great.
and step
Like
from,
embodiment.
more fully from map into territory.
Yep.
So
Great.
we've got a lot of these things going on, and it was funny because, as I said at the beginning of the show, about 9 months ago, I had the idea. I was like, I really need, I want Diane to be a part of this, because I saw some of the interviews that you were doing with Jeff Salzman in the Daily Evolver around things like the Me Too movement and sort of conflicts around gender and racism and things like that. And I always really lean in because I think you have a lot of both skill and wisdom when it comes to these topics, and you navigate them so expertly. And so it was sort of, the idea was forming as I was also doing these series of shows with Ken about politics. And one of the shows we had was I think I named it "Saving the Baby from the Bathwater," the baby in the bathwater. And it's
Okay.
sort of like saving liberalism from itself. So we went through and we looked at things like white privilege and gender gaps and things like that, and said, okay, what's true here and what's partial, and more importantly, how can we save social justice from being flushed out with the SJWs, basically.
Hmm. Hmm.
And all of this really culminated in just like, man, I need to get in touch with Diane. And so I finally did. And we started talking, and you told me about this book that you're writing.
Hmm.
And once I read the description, well, first you told me about the book, and then Julia sent me sort of the summary copy of it. And I was just stunned how like on brand your book is for what I wanted to do
Oh, great.
with the show. And just so everyone knows, the book is called Compassionate Conversations,
Hmm.
How to Speak and Listen from the Heart. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So, Compassionate Conversations is being published by Shambhala, and it's due to be out next spring, although the pre-order link is up. I wrote it with Gabriel Wilson, who's an integralist, and some of you know him. He has a degree in education from Stanford. He's also biracial. His father's African American. His mother's from Brazil. She's white. And then Kimberly Lowe, who's a colleague and a friend. She also studies Zen as well. She's from the UK. Her family is Chinese. Her mother lives in Malaysia. So she has a very powerful relationship to both the United Kingdom, but also to Asia. And so it was really important to get a perspective outside of the US. And so Kim is the third author on the book. And basically what we did is we tried to stay away from a book, that would sort of describe what your politics should be, and rather a book that would give you a skill set and a set of considerations for the kind of conversations that you want to engage. Ken always says that thoughts are things, and that we talk about something for 100 or 200 years before we're actually able to fully enact those changes. So he really has asserted how important it is that we have conscious conversations. And so we talk about, basic communication skills like listening skills, assertiveness skills, reframing, using first, second, and third person perspectives. But then we also address our views of social privilege and right use of power, those kinds of things. So it's a little bit more of the basic communication, a little bit more of the insights of integral levels of development, which has been extremely important in my work, as you know. And then finally, take up some of the insights really of pluralism and of the healthy social justice movements that, anybody who wants to have really politically adept conversation these days, it's helpful to have, working understanding of these particular things. So we tried to include some of that as well as looking at social activism through all four quadrants. That we have to change in terms of our thoughts and belief systems, that we have to change in terms of our individual behaviors, that it's important for society, if you will, to transform. We've done lots of individual transformation work. I've been thinking a lot lately about the lessons of transformation. This might be an interesting topic for Ken. What are the fundamental takeaways of the human potential movement and transformative processes? And how do those same transformative processes apply to society on a much larger scale? And are they applicable or are they not? So I've been thinking about that. And then, of course, systems change. And the place where I worked on systems was in the judiciary, working on racial and ethnic fairness, on diversity training, on trying to wake up the Utah judiciary to what does it really mean to be fair in a place where, people of color are massively overrepresented throughout, particularly the criminal justice system. So, so it's about conversation with an ear to social action, without wading too deeply into that territory, because people have lots of beliefs about what you should think and feel. And so we tried to stay away from the content and give more the skills and the mechanisms for having good conversations.
That's beautiful. And I think that is what is, more needed today than anything else, and any other sort of like, here's my view and let me just sort of drop this on your head and believe me, this is the right view. Now, that said, I do tend to have the correct political views, and I think the world would probably be better off if they listened to me more often.
Run for office, my friend.
I can barely do a show with people, let alone stand in front of a crowd and do all that. But it's, I love how you describe that, and also how your book, in a lot of ways, it feels like a Trojan horse. I mean, it seems like you're speaking integrally to issues that people at sort of the green altitude tend to be very, very attracted to.
Yes, that's right.
Very passionate about, and sometimes a little bit, sort of partial. About. So I think that's awesome. And just in terms of how that fits into, again, what we're trying to do these days here at Integral Life, there's a few sort of directions I've been trying to encourage us to begin moving in. And, one of them is, as I said, sort of taking that next, I think there's a logical next step that takes us from, sort of the abstract enactment of integral as a map, and into the actual territory of integral embodiment, empowerment, change making, things like that. To give people, as you're talking about, the tools and the skills that they need to not only transform their lives and their inner world, but actually begin to transform the world out there, sort of piece by piece in whatever way is meaningful to you.
Mm-hmm.
Helping people find a way out of just this, terrible polarization that we're going through right now, by learning how to manage and integrate sort of the fundamental polarities that are at the core of these conflicts, to ground ourselves in this big holistic view, that Integral gives us, while still being able to take skillful and, sometimes deliberately partial action in the world. And really, I think most importantly, to help the Integral movement shift away from being almost like this like integral treehouse sitting, high above it all. I think it's easy to get kind of lost in that view from 50,000 feet, and helping people to become more like, to step into the gaps, you know what I mean? And to become really like the connective tissue that's pulling people together, pulling these different altitudes together, and really pulling the world back together again in a certain kind of sense. And I think, I personally believe that Integral is capable of doing all of this. A mature Integral is capable of doing all this. And that's why I look to, leaders and role models such as yourself to sort of try to, bring a little bit more light to the path.
Well, let's make one distinction that at least has been important to me, Corey, and let me know what you think about this, which is that we can talk about integral theory and particularly Ken's work, just the work that he's done in terms of kind of mapping evolution and mapping the evolution of culture and levels of development in the human being, and quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, the importance of first person, of second person, of third person. Those things have become really important in my work. So the theory is a tremendous treasure. And what I also learned from Ken is that integral consciousness comes on board of its own accord. It's like in the hard drive, and that we move from, being embedded in a very powerful and reliable mythic meme consciousness, as he would say, and then we move into kind of testing our own capacities in the world at a kind of strive drive level. And he's read across all sorts of researchers, but I might be accessing spiral dynamics, and we move into pluralism and the sensitive self, and we care about wounding, and we care about our respective sensitivities and our individuality and our unique positions in the world. And then at a certain point, as I understand it, what we mean by second tier is that suddenly we're getting sea legs again, that it kind of corresponds to the earliest experience of being a human being, where we're actually experiencing the world in kind of a new way. And there's more flexibility of mind. There's a capacity to relate with complexity without becoming attached or fixated or overwhelmed. There's the ability to see difference as exciting and stimulating as opposed to threatening, because difference is extremely threatening for most of human evolution, as we know. To understand that identity doesn't have to be so fixed and solid. And once we get over being disoriented by how free our identity is, learning that we can relate to it relatively with not mistaking it for our absolute identity. And I think, my encounter with Ken and with the Integral Institute had to do with, giving me a good dose of theory, which really helped me in my work, but also helping me understand that, some people at certain, points in their life are capable of a little more freedom and a little more inclusion without a lot of effort, but they still need skills. Even if consciousness can do this, it still has to be trained. So training is really still very, very important. Training in communication skills, negotiation skills, but also in sitting meditation, so that we can really taste individual identity and how it is basically very, very small compared to consciousness itself, you might say. Is that fair?
Oh, I think that's beautifully said. And I totally agree. I mean, it feels like the integral maturation process is, well, of course, it's sort of sequential in a certain kind of way. And each of these can be, sort of taught and trained. And I think it comes with, the first thing that comes online tends to be integral thinking. It's when we fall in love with the map and with, the sort of the artifacts that are created from integral consciousness.
Yes.
And the second act is actually inhabiting that integral consciousness itself. And, you know, that usually comes second. Usually I remember one of the most important lessons you ever gave me was like 12 years ago. We were doing Big Mind, and I was like, Diane, I don't know if I'm doing this right or if I'm just imagining that I'm doing this right. You know, sort of cascading. And your simple advice to me was, Corey, fake it till you make it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was
My
all
teacher
you said.
used to say that a lot. Yeah.
And it was perfect. It was like
Yeah.
exactly what I needed to hear. And I think a lot of times that's what integral thinking does for people. It allows people to sort of fake it until they make it. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, you know, what they're doing is they're using integral thinking as sort of a construct of their mind, and
Yes.
slowly that begins to get internalized.
Yes.
It becomes more your sort of your compass and your sensibility, you know, more so than it is sort of this you know, set of binoculars that you're holding up to your eyes every time you take a look.
Yeah.
And then after integral sort, you know, from integral thinking brings you into integral being, but then I think that there's another leap from integral being to integral doing,
Yes. Very
where
good.
I think real skill development becomes exceptionally important at this stage, because
Yeah.
we get so full and we feel like, God, my interiors are just overflowing. And I want this to spill out in every other sort of dimension of my, I want to be able to show up as fully as I possibly can, but without, you know, an actual sort of trainable skill set. It just sort of gets all welled up and creates its own sort of, you know, second tier neuroses. And I can talk to you for hours about those.
Well, and Ken did something in a seminar one time that I was really very impressed by. And because it is true that we begin by having this kind of ability to think in ways that are new and free and flexible. And then we start to experience our identity and our consciousness itself expanding. And then when it comes to doing, it seems anything is possible, because we have so much room, so much room to think, so much room to contemplate, so much room to consider. And then that in itself can almost be really overwhelming in terms of what is it we should do. And he did a very brilliant thing. There was a man in a seminar that we did in California who was probably in his early 40s, clearly successful, probably somebody who was in business or in a corporate setting or whatever, obviously had some real capacity. And he asked Ken the question over the phone. You know, basically he framed it as, I could do just about anything. And, but I don't quite know what direction to move in. There's so much that needs to be done. And I feel like I could make a contribution. And Ken was really interesting. It's one of the few times that I almost heard him almost like therapeutically work with someone and basically say to them, you know, this idea that you could do anything is immature. You know, it's actually out of relationship with your actual life. The fact is that while mind is capable of everything, the body and one's circumstances and one's karma are actually quite specific. And if you're not looking to your very life, to what your actual skills are, listening to the feedback that you're getting from people around what you do well and where you make a contribution, and then following that up and actually seeing what comes of that, basically you're still in an imaginal realm. And I think that that's what he meant by immature. And he basically told the guy to grow up.
Right.
It was really amazing.
Yeah.
And I think the guy felt extremely seen and moved and in a certain way humbled, but in a good way. You know, he wasn't insulted, he wasn't put off, but he definitely was like, there's something that Ken was saying that was absolutely true. It was really this moment of seeing Ken respond as a teacher as opposed to a pandit, that where he actually was giving very beautiful and perfect guidance to someone. So this integral doing, or this enactment, or as we say in Zen, free functioning, you know, compassion in action, is related 100% to who we are. It's not other than that. It has to be completely 100% embedded in our life, in our skills, in our relationships, and in our own development. Otherwise, it's just a fantasy.
Right. Yeah. Oh, it's beautifully said. And I love how you used the phrase imaginal. I just did an episode with Ryan Olkey where we're talking about exactly that, how to more fully inhabit your spiritual life which basically means stepping out of what is oftentimes a very imaginal sort of enactment of spirituality. And I mean, this was my 20s basically, right? Where like every spiritual idea I had was worn sort of, on my sleeve as almost an ornamentation, as a way to say, look how spiritual my ego is, you know what I mean? And it became a part of my identity. And then through, the process of, which I talked about with Ryan, various, medical traumas, going through the experience with my daughter and all that, it stripped away so much of that. So much of that ornamentation sort of went by the wayside, and really, I think, brought me into a deeper relationship with what, for me, at this point in my life, feels like it's what really matters. And that's basically like presence, empathy, and skillful action has become what sort of all this has boiled down to. And so I really appreciate the invitation to sort of step it. And it's not about leaving the imaginal behind or anything like that, because it's, the things that we can enact with our mind, as Ken says, thoughts are things, and the things that we can experience, in the subtle or inner consciousness or whatever are extraordinary. They're beautiful, but it's also really easy to sort of get lost in that and to cut yourself off from genuine embodiment, genuine enactment. And, I think it still leaves the door open to a certain sort of, anywhere, there's like the spectrum from just sort of like plain old cynicism to just like straight up existential malaise.
Absolutely. Yeah, because another time that we explored what we're talking about, Corey, was when we did the integral spiritual experience, and our theme was cosmic creativity, if you remember. And we gave a lot of attention to how form comes into being, and that form has to come, very subtly into thought. And then as it comes into thought, then that thought is worked with and explored and refined. And then when the time is ripe, then that begins to be brought into form in the gross. And that transition from the imagination or the subtle to the actual heavy workings of gravity and the problem of resources and financing something, or getting a job, or actually finding an organization that you can work in to establish certain, values or norms. It's like the subtle to the gross is some serious heavy lifting. And it requires real skill. Now, obviously, some people are better at it than others, and people who have real executive skills may find themselves in roles where they're leading and organizing in that way. And then it may be somebody is really good at bringing people together and inspiring, or it could be that you're very good at dealing with children, and so you find yourself in that realm. And there's a difference in scale. I mean, some people have a real gift for scale. When I think about somebody like Muhammad Yunus, who's basically developed microlending, and in Bangladesh, kind of a cell phone in every village woman's hand, and working with, Nike to develop the $1 tennis shoe. Some people have a real mind for how to actually scale things and also monetize things, and those are very particular gifts. Others of us don't. And so we work at a different scale. But whatever our gifts are, in order for them to be truly realized, you might have to be a writer, you might have to do mathematics, but you have to actually do it. And then you do it in a community of practice, so that you're not just kind of in your own sort of slightly thought disordered reality. there's actually
I feel attacked right now, Diane.
Sorry. No, you've got Ken. You'll be fine.
Well, I mean, that's and thank God for that, because what Ken offers us is he doesn't just give us a map, right? No. I mean, the map is beautiful, and the map is, as far as I can tell, really is sort of all inclusive, as all inclusive as I could imagine it to be at this time, anyway. But more than that, he doesn't just give you a map. He also gives you this little like red star that says you are here.
He does, absolutely. Gives you a reference point.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And actually, it shows, okay, so here's sort of a map of just like my broadest possible human potential and all of that. But here's where I am right now. Here's my gifts. here's my shadows, here's where I'm, challenged, here's where things come a little bit more easily to me, here's my psychograph, and all of this.
Kind of cosmic address.
Yeah, exactly. It's your cosmic address. All of this comes all of this is informed from your cosmic address. And then I think where a lot of people feel a little bit stuck is in that next step, which is like, okay, so now what? Especially when we're talking about some of these really big problems. Before the pre-show, you said, what does Ken think about climate change? And I said, he's very concerned about it, and we probably really need to do a show about it. But I don't even know how to sort of design that show in a way that it's going to be, more than just framing the problem 1,000 different ways, and actually gives people, something that they can do, something that they can enact in their own lives. And that's true for a lot of these, what, Ken calls wicked problems, just these massive sort of, multivalent, multi-dimensional problems that can't be fixed sort of piecemeal at all. And I think it creates this paralysis in people. They say, if I can't fix it all at once, then what the hell am I supposed to do?
Well, I think, I've been giving a lot of thought to climate change myself. And in fact, my Saturday course, my Zen course, we're going to be exploring our relationship to climate change from first, second, and third person perspective, looking at the issue of language, looking at how do we work with science and the information, what is the emotional impact of that, how do we navigate emotions like grief, fear, and anger, how do we, the problem with climate is it's not the problem with climate, it's the problem with the human community, is that we tend to start to compete and become rivals. And it's very difficult for us to cooperate. I mean, apparently we could solve a lot of this if we could get along. And that leads us to the problem of human development. And it also leads us to the way in which expertise is used. I mean, weaponized is overused these days, but expertise becomes kind of weaponized in a weird way. So instead of the shaman and the scientist actually working together on something, there's competing sets of knowing and what is more true. And at this point, an integral view would say, well, we actually need the shamanic relationship to the natural world, and we need the scientific we need the scientific input and views. We also need the artist's ability to tolerate not knowing, right? We need the soldier's ability to execute and to know what are our 1, 2, 3 goals, whether it's the carbon tax or whether it's divesting from the fossil fuel industry or whatever those top 3 things are. I think if your listeners knew the sort of top 3 priorities in terms of what they can actually do, that would be helpful. Working on carbon tax legislation is one. It's not the only thing, and people disagree. But again, if we end up warring over these particular strategies as opposed to building a coherent strategy, because whole systems change requires us to be whole. And that's kind of a high bar.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, really. Do. And particularly when it comes to just how information moves in the world today, it's very different.
And how it changes.
Yeah, it used to be that for the most part, information flowed through experts, authors and journalists and scholars and so forth. And now information flows around experts. And I think that just so completely changes the ball game for the vast majority of people, where they're now getting, it's what was it Isaac Asimov said, your ignorance is as good as my expertise. That's a terrible paraphrase, but that is sort of the a-perspectival madness, as Ken would say, that we've sort of lapsed into, where, we live in this completely flattened sort of media landscape. Where it's really difficult to tell facts from opinions. It's hard to tell, what truths are more or less partial than the others. And as things continue to get polarized, it only gets worse. And, another thing, Diane, that's sort of on your CV that I think is really helpful for us is how you facilitate things like shadow work. Because I think that when it comes to these big problems, climate change, gun violence, what have you, a lot of times people are getting stuck in what some people in our community have been calling sort of these collective shadows. And I think that this presents itself oftentimes a little bit differently depending on which sort of side of the political spectrum you're on. For the right, it's often collective shadows around things like the deep state, and globalism, the violence of the state, et cetera. And for the left, it's the collective shadows of
It's
things.
fear of change is
Yeah.
one way to say that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. The fear of change is a big part of that sort of conservative reaction. And then on the left, it's the collective shadows of racism, sexism, homophobia, things like white privilege.
The fear that things won't change.
Yeah, well said. And so these are often held as these collective shadows, but of course, I think there's a certain kind of nobility that comes with trying to suss out, identify, and maybe challenge some of these collective shadows. But the problem is if we haven't done our own shadow work in a really, really deep and sort of diligent way, if we haven't, really closely examined our biases and assumptions and sort of our conditioned blind spots, then we never really see that collective shadow at all, right? I mean, the collective shadow by its definition is so big, it's so much bigger than any of us. That it's hard for even the cleanest, the person who's done the most work in terms of cleaning up to see it with any real clarity. Let alone sort of the little sort of micro collective shadows that emerge in places like Facebook or Reddit or 4chan or 8chan or even the interval community. We all sort of are subject to our own biases, and it's really hard to tell sort of where my shadow ends and the collective shadow begins.
Yeah, I should say. Well, what comes to mind in this moment is if we get back to our theme of integral justice warrior and, that a warrior trains. A warrior trains. That's one thing a warrior does. The qualities of courage, of duty, self-sacrifice, loyalty, those aren't necessarily naturally arising in the human. Those things have to be trained. And if we look at the integral model of training, that what Ken has said is basically that we need to train our cognition. We need to actually have the most upgraded way of thinking, which the map and the community helps us with a lot. We have to train our body. Every warrior has to be in shape, right? You have to actually be able to be somewhat responsive to life and have energy available and be able to move and shift and adjust to life. And then we have to train ourselves spiritually, because the whole point of warriorship is it's always in the service of something greater. It's always for the benefit of society or of the whole or of spiritual development. It's never for oneself. Self-sacrifice wouldn't be part of warriorship values if it weren't for that. And then in terms of integral practice, the next thing is to do our psychological work. And mainly what Ken has talked about is shadow. I think doing psychodynamic work is important a lot because our habits from our upbringing, our childhood are really embedded and often ill-adapted,
Yeah.
So being a kind of a student of our family of origin is helpful. But the other thing is shadow work. And the way Ken framed it, Jung talks about shadow, as I understand it, as, anything within consciousness that is sort of not exposed to light, so you can't see it clearly. The way that Ken has talked about shadow is any part of awareness or consciousness that can't be held as I. So you're racist, I'm not. You're eco-terrorist, I'm not. Whatever it is that you are and I'm not, whatever it is they are and I'm not. And so the question of kind of taking back that projection and finding, at least to any degree, the part of us that's also like that. Because when we discover that, energy is released. Usually people cry or laugh when they start to see that. And it changes the way we respond to the world. Things cease to be enemies in the same way. And then we can act with more wisdom and more compassion, because as soon as we're holding that you're this and I'm not, that creates a dualism that just is simply phenomenologically wrong. And so because of that, we become more unified, become much closer to how things are, and then we can act more skillfully. So I agree with you. Shadow work is really, really important. The problem I have is that people think of shadow work kind of like, the way I think of shadow work is like you do shadow work when your shadow's showing up. And how do you know your shadow's showing up? Because you're getting feedback, because you become massively incongruent, because you're really disturbed, because it's not just that you simply go through life doing shadow work. You actually pay attention to when this thing that you can't see or name is affecting you. And because you can't see or name it, you sort of counterintuitively turn towards this unknown. And then, as I said, energy gets released. And I think the studies of shadow work over eons is interesting. You know, people used to make offerings and scapegoat and sacrifice and do all kinds of things to take that energetic buildup of not me, somehow dispel it. The shadow work is a similar kind of thing. It's both ritualistic, but it also energetically has a big impact. It sounds woo unless you do it. In my retreats, by day 3 or 4, we have to do it. I can feel it. Just needs to happen.
It's a release valve.
It's a release valve, absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, the problem too with shadow work is when you hold it too sort of glibly, you know, like sometimes I'm standing in front of an asshole and I'm really like reacting to this asshole I'm in front of. And so I do my 3, 2, 1. And, you know, at the end of the day, I realize, hey,
you're still an asshole.
You're still an asshole. Now, I might be a little bit less reactive to your assholery.
Yes.
Right. That's why I'm glad I did the practice. But at the end of the day, you're still an asshole. And that's where I think having this discernment, having this really skillful discernment and being able to sort of swing the blade when you need to swing the blade, right? That aspect of warriorship while still being connected to the whole.
You have to be
holistic view and all that, but you're making a deliberately partial action or judgment or discernment or whatever it might be that says, hey, okay, you know what? You're still an asshole. And, you know, this comes up oftentimes in Integral where, you know, people say things like, oh, you know, you get so activated by Donald Trump because you haven't integrated your inner Trump. And, you know, my response is often like, you have no idea how much of my own asshole I've integrated. That's really weird, doesn't it? I didn't mean that in a weird way. But, you know, like I've done a lot of work sort of dredging that up. And no, I'm just reacting because this guy is kind of an asshole. Now, that's my political opinion. I don't want to piss anyone off who's watching right now. We all, you know, opinions are kind of like assholes. But, you know, the point being that I think sometimes use things like shadow work to, again, sort of create this edifice where well, I'm above all of this. I don't feel conflict and I don't feel friction because I've done my and if you do, it's because you clearly still have some shadows that you need to metabolize. And that to me is just as sort of inflammatory as saying, oh, you're so green. Or something like that. It's making an object out of someone else's subject, and it's just, you know, kind of rude.
Yeah, it usually doesn't work either.
It doesn't work very well, right? It's kind of funny, isn't it? Like I've never seen an internet debate take place where like one person actually changes their
never happens.
You know, not even a little bit. You're doing those things for everyone else who happens to be reading.
Hey, should we see if anybody's on the line and if they have any questions?
Yeah, I would love to. So just so everyone knows, we want to talk to you. These shows are always the best when you participate with them. So let me tell you how to do that. First off, if you're watching on YouTube right now, you can go to integrallife.com/live, which will bring you to the Integral Live page. There you'll find a streaming video player. Right underneath that is a link that'll take you into the Zoom app. You come into the Zoom app if you want to participate with us. Once you're in there, you can do one of two things. You can either click the raise my hand button, which tells us you want us to turn on your camera, and you can interact with us sort of in real time. Or if you're feeling a little bit shy, you can press the Q&A button and submit a written question or comment or suggestion or what have you. So we totally invite you guys to do that. We already have a hand raised, Diane. This is fantastic. So good. I'm going to bring Jocelyn on over.
Great.
Hello.
Mute Jocelyn. Hello, Jocelyn.
Hi.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Hi, Diane. Oh my gosh, I have missed you. It's been a long time since I've been to your classes, and I saw your email pop up, and I wanted to jump on. But
I'm glad.
I wanted to ask a question about what you guys think about diet in correlation to the shadow and shadow work, because you know, I felt like shadowy things coming up from my psychological development in correlation to diet. And I started, you know, I'd never been a very religious person, but I started researching more into Christ and how he was fasting and, you know, cleaning the body. And I did a really prolonged fast and found a lot of profound changes and insights from doing that. And so I wanted to see what your guys' thoughts are on that in correlation to because I've read Ken Wilber's book on integral meditation, and I thought it was brilliant. And so how that has to do kind of chemically combined with the shadow in our psychological development.
Great question.
Yeah, well, the first thing that's important to me, Jocelyn, is just hearing you say that you very intuitively went down a track of seeing that, Christ fasted a lot. Rumi talks a lot about fasting and not eating as well. And that when you did it, that you actually felt some transformative qualities. And it sounds to me like certain things were released. Is that fair?
Yeah, very.
Yeah. So I used to fast when I was younger, and I haven't for a long time. So you're inspiring me in a way to do it. I think this thing about emptying out and slowing down and simply experiencing what's there when, in a certain way, traditional Zen practice always works through a little bit of exhaustion. And I think that maybe fasting also works in a way to kind of simplify and put us in touch with what's most essential. So I would certainly, somebody's sending a note. It sounds to me like positive is what I would say. So can you read that note that somebody just put in the chat?
Someone says that the audio is occurring in triplicate, which tells me that it's possible you might have two windows open. It's possible that you have the Zoom streaming player open and a version in your web browser. That often happens, and then you get sort of a delayed effect. But yeah, back to your question, Jocelyn, which I think is a really great one, because there's so many different ways to sort of approach that question, right? I mean, Diane, you and I were just talking about how difficult it can be to tell where my personal shadow ends and sort of the collective shadow, whatever that means, begins. And I think that really comes into play when it comes to things like what choices am I making and what choices am I not making around the energy that I choose to put into my body. And in a certain way, our choices are in a lot of conditioned and sort of limited by the options that are given to us in the lower right quadrant, sort of techno-economically. So we've got all this factory farming, which is itself responsible for a lot of environmental degradation and things like that, which is has its own sort of shadow quality to it that we're participating in. And then we have sort of the individual shadow of using food as for comfort or for substitute gratification or what have you, something I do honestly all the time. Food and diet for me is one of my growth edges. It's something I've always had a difficult relationship with, and I'm always trying to bring more consciousness to. And then there's sort of Ken Wilber's full spectrum mindfulness approach to questions like this, which is we all sort of grow through these successive stages. And right there at the very first stage is the hunger stage. And because it tends to be such a pre-verbal stage, there's a lot of opportunities for things to kind of go wrong there, and things that you will never be able to remember because it's so, ingrained, and it's things that, could have happened when you were 6 months old or something. In my case, I had really bad food poisoning when I was 6 months old and almost died. And as a result, I've always sort of linked that with the fact that I've been, incredibly narrow-minded. I'm a very open-minded person, but not when it comes to food. I'm such a picky eater. There's some things I just am not able to put into my body because it triggers this like disgust reaction. And it's, it's palpable, it's powerful for me. So it's almost like a shadow that's so deep, it lives more like in my body than it lives in my mind in a certain kind of way. And Ken's full spectrum approach, which is simply to sort of hold this stage, hold the territory of the stage in your consciousness, and just sort of, gently see if there's any kinks in there or anything that needs to be, liberated or smoothed out or what have you, so that you can reintegrate sort of those pieces of yourself has been helpful for me. I don't know if that's
great. Yeah, no, I love that perspective, especially because that's what blew me away by Ken's book talking about the oral anal phase. And when I read that, I was like, boom, that was really hit me hard on all the times that I've emotionally gone to that, and to soothe myself. and how that was a part of my shadow, you know?
Yeah, it's an easy one to go to, that's for sure. Because,
Yeah.
no matter where you go, you can always find a Twinkie.
Yeah.
In my case, a choco dial. Have you ever had a choco dial? They're chocolate covered Twinkies, and they're so bad for me.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate being able to jump on.
Yeah, nice to hear your voice.
All right, so if anyone else wants to raise their hand and ask a question, please do so. In the meantime, looks like we have a written question. Is there an integral platform which connects integral ground root initiatives and practitioners? I imagine such a platform could be a practical way to bring integral out of the treehouse and into the cracks in the ground. That's a really great metaphor. I should use that sometime. Not that I know of right now. Diane, do you have I do have something I could talk about, but
No, I mean, back in the day, we were working on kind of trying to connect these smaller integral communities around the world through some sort of platform or network, and I don't think we ever quite got there. So what do you have to say, Corey?
Well, I have been working in recent months on building what I've just been kind of generically calling the integral directory, which it's largely made not for sort of individuals to list themselves, but it's for the original intention was to make this more for professionals, for organizations, for even things
like a LinkedIn kind of thing.
Sort of like a LinkedIn, but with a little, something that people will actually use, unlike LinkedIn. So yeah, that's something I've been working on. It even has things like the ability to find a salon in your area, post classified ads, job listings. I think that would be actually pretty huge for this if integral organizations were able to directly appeal to integral individuals who are looking for work. And I think that might bring a little bit more cohesion to the space. So I've got that like half built right now, still sort of ironing out the kinks, but I'm hoping that's something that maybe we can release in early 2020.
Cool.
Yeah. It's my thing lately, Diane. I don't want to do any real work, so I just build platforms so other people can do work. I'm a very lazy man. That's how I...
Well, you're building the nervous system of a world centrism, so.
Yeah, I'll take that. Daniela says, to be an integral justice warrior, one, we have to overcome the fear of being seen and speak out. This is really stopping me from moving into integral action. Any thoughts on how to move forward into integral action?
Well, I mean, why don't we, first of all, just hear your question and give you a minute to feel like you're being seen and being heard, and let you do what Corey described and just really take in that experience. What is it like right now to have your question recognized? It may be that there's just something around how you were seen when you were small that's still lingering and creating anxiety in you. And I think it really ultimately has more to do with your self-relation than it has to do with being seen by others, because usually if you're comfortable seeing yourself, then you can tolerate other people seeing you. So I think that would be important. Do you want to interact around this question a little bit?
Yeah, Daniela, if you want to have a little, real time back and forth with Diane, you can just raise your hand and we'll turn your camera on. Or not, totally your call. What we'll do, Diane, is we'll give her a few moments to respond to that if she wants.
Yeah, just feel it. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, looks like we have two Michaels waiting to ask a question. So I'm going to take Michael number 1.
Okay.
Let me unmute you, Michael.
There's Michael.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. Actually, my question and also comment relates to the other one that you're waiting on, is that because of my financial class, I can't participate what I would like to of be in the presence of like Diane in the midst of what she's teaching. So I do a lot of reading her books or other people and watching these videos, and that is useful. And it does inform me when I'm kind of out in the streets trying to practice integral, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, sure.
And I guess my question, Diane, to you is, I'm trying to formulate it, but is that a type of warriorship that is just gonna come with the evolution of Integral, where there's this little class distinction that's kind of working at a different level? I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Well, let's think about it. Are you talking now about your ability to pay, say, for instance, to take an online class with me or come retreat or?
Yeah, and how, and even, not only pay, but be able to make arrangements to go.
Yes,
And so,
everything.
Yeah, everything. But so there's this sideways of at least using the technology to bring Integral into my nervous system.
Exactly.
But not having access to which I think would be helpful of a real life teacher or facilitator to kind of check my own shadow, like you were saying. I just don't have that option. I have to really be totally honest with myself when I'm fucking up.
Great. Well, I mean, in a funny way, I was saying this to Corey a little bit earlier, that, Ken's the first person I knew that really used the internet. And he had this site called Integral Naked, and he basically started to broadcast across the internet all of these considerations about integral theory and all these different points of view and spiritual practice and, just everything. And so in a certain way, he sort of created, if you will, this integral community that's really worldwide. And the sort of downside of that is that we're all located in really, really different places. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of organizing to get yourself to a place where there's an integral event or an integral teacher. So I think the best thing is maybe just to realize how awesome it is that we can actually connect online. And then, as you said, if you have people that you're close to that you can trust to give you feedback, and to give yourself feedback. But it is true. I mean, I say to people, you need to take feedback from yourself because it's important that you're honest with yourself. You need to take feedback from people you're close to, who you love and admire, not just random people that want to give you feedback. You need to take feedback from a guide of some kind, a teacher or a guide, someone you really feel has your best interests at heart. And then you need to take feedback from reality itself.
Yeah, right.
And if we open ourselves to all of that, then we're definitely in that domain in which we can't help but grow and change.
Well, and it seems to be, it ties into about Ken, the way he dealt with that one person, that it ever since, because I've been part of it since Ken did the Integral Naked. So
have you really? Wow.
I've had to grow up into an adult and accept the limitations, and I really like how you framed the notion of the subtle coming back into the gross.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I feel Integral is about opening up from the gross, but then a lot of the frustration, or what I see trying to myself and integrally participate with the world at this time of trouble, is that, okay, how does the subtle come back into the gross?
Absolutely. I do have to give you some feedback though, Michael.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I really like your pink headphones.
Thank you.
And secondly, the way you're sitting with the fan over your head, you look like one of those when we were kids. Remember they had the propellers going around?
Yeah. Cecil, and yeah.
So I think being playful is probably a big part of your contribution.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely.
Very much. I appreciate your feedback.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And it actually reminds me of another platform that I sort of have been fantasizing about creating, which is a way to help the integral community move beyond sort of the inherent disembodiment and fragmentation that comes with social media. Because in social media, we're never actually talking to each other. We're just responding to words on a screen.
Yes.
We have, I think, a lot of challenges around enacting those words as if they're coming from an actual subject somewhere else,
Mhm.
And so for me, some of the most powerful and poignant experiences that I've had in the integral community has been in programs like this. Talking with folks like you, using platforms like Zoom to just have that face-to-face component, because it's amazing how much more you get just by having that very, very simple feedback between us, where I can see how you respond to something I say, etc. And I would love to at some point create a platform where it's almost like people would be able to opt into these ad hoc salons and commit however they're appropriate. But like at a press of a button, there'd be a waiting room. And as soon as like 6 people fill up the waiting room, then a set of instructions gets sent out and practice guides and all that. And then suddenly you've got people who might be on, complete different sides of the planet who are enjoying this very intimate sort of salon experience with each other in a more face-to-face kind of way. And I think it's on the one hand, the internet is sort of destroying us, because it's largely responsible for so much of this polarization, but it can also be the vehicle, I think, that really weaves us back together. We just it's sort of around.
Whenever I start lamenting the internet, I just think about how it's introduced me to Ken.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, totally. All right, so we've got another question from another Michael, and then we've got Sharona. So I'm going to bring Michael on first.
Okay, great. Hi, Michael.
And once he gets on, I will.
Michael Wilson.
Michael.
Hi, Michael.
There we go. How you doing, Michael?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi. I just I saw your email yesterday, and I just felt that I should probably contribute, and then things worked out. Like, I don't know how long I could be on here. I'm watching 3 kids at the
Great.
moment.
Good for you.
But I guess first a little bit of backstory. And first, I just want to say I'm really resonating with everything that everyone's talking about today, and when bringing up, like Michael was saying, like a lot of us are having, or just it seems like we're all dealing with sort of the same problems a little bit, at least in some area. So, the financial thing is a thing. And of course, work with that how you can. And then, I've been fasting, so I was like, okay, wow.
Have you really? Great.
Synchronicities. Yeah, and just sort of, I don't want to get into a long detail, but I had gotten, a little overweight before, but since probably January this year, I've lost about 40 pounds. But it's just been this continual process that ended up with me then deciding, at the beginning of the summer, I need to really clear out and just, fast for a little bit, and then slowly transition to a better diet, and going to vegetarianism, and then to veganism. That's a very recent, but regardless of that, like just the effect of clearing out all the processed stuff that was in my body was really powerful, and really allowed me to really progress, I guess, my awakening to a point that I had. Now, I picked up a copy of A Theory of Everything in probably 2001, when I was 22, 23 years old, and as a gift for my mother. But anyway, then, I started
Nice.
the introduction, and for me at that age, at that point, it was like making, contact with aliens or something. I was like, whoa, there's this intelligence here that I've never come across. So anyway, so that had a huge, profound impact on me. And then I was there for Integral Naked. If you think about it now, that was kind of the precursor to podcasts. And what else stuff is going on with that now.
I was just writing about this yesterday, actually, how so much of the podcasting industry is actually sort of returning to a model that we helped in a lot of ways innovate all the way back in 2003, which is the premium podcast model.
So true.
Exactly. So we have that, and then there's a lot. I'm gonna have more. I hope you guys keep doing this.
Where are you living, Michael? Just so I can locate you in the world.
Okay, I'm in Ohio.
Okay, good.
Right now.
Okay.
I was born in Texas. My parents were sort of gypsy hippies, so I kind of traveled all over the country when I was growing up, and I've been in California, and then back in Austin, and now I'm in Ohio. But but thank you. So and we've talked about like collective shadow, right? So let's talk about, and I don't know who else or if anyone else has had experience with collective awakening, because what happened was I sort of, like Michael, we were talking before, I connected with Integral. I had huge, what I would call like big mind experiences all through my 20s, like these huge peak experiences where I was totally flowing and integrating. What happened was I had to, I had to make a living. I had to feed my family and everything. First, I got a job as a graphic designer, and that ended up creating like a lot of back problems and stuff. I'm fine now because I started doing yoga a couple years ago. But, and so there was just all this like kind of constriction and like closing down a lot of these things that have really just kind of lit up when, I decided to dive back into it, and do the cleansing of the body and things like that. And as soon as I started talking at all to other people about what was happening, or finding people that sort of were doing the similar things, then I started, I found a few people that, were kind of experiencing the same things. And as Diane was saying, you need like a teacher, you need feedback, you need people around you. I don't know, and I don't know how this happens, but sort of by accident, I found someone who was like just at the level where I can teach them, and someone that's just at the level where they can teach me. And so that's where we're at the moment. But I don't know where else to go with that, except that I do have an offering, and it has to do with the internet. Okay, with how we communicate.
What were you going to say about
Social media.
collective awakening, Michael?
Just that I didn't know if that was the thing, like, and I've been experiencing it lately, and I'm just putting that out there and asking if anyone else has had experience with that in any way. And since there's collective shadow, it seems like there should be that manifest somehow.
Well, I think that.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I think the integral community certainly is a community of awakening, of waking up and growing up.
But it's, as you were saying, very dispersed. Like even me being involved in integral for 20 something years, like I'm not personal friends with anyone who's integral or who knows these concepts besides my mother, who is a professor in California. And, so anyway, we're all dispersed. So there's that. And even the people I'm talking about now, they're geographically a long way away from me. But so.
Well, let's stay open to that. What do you want to say about the internet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fix the internet for us.
Okay. So we need just a baseline. Like Corey was saying, if, you're just reacting to the ideas out there, and then it's just an object. You're like, someone says something you don't like, if you either say nothing and take it with you, or you have a reaction that is just, just reacting to whatever they said, just the base. We don't have a baseline for communication or civil, or what I would call universal regard for baseline. Like, okay, before we start talking, and this is, obviously, when I say this has to start with people who understand it, and then spread out from there. But if you start with a baseline of universal regard, is that before we start talking, then I'm going to recognize you as, a person, as a divine entity, and I'm going to hold you in regard and realize that is, or divine, whatever you want to, however term you want to use, kind of universal regard. And it's the idea of like, namaste, like I'm regarding you. And there's an easy way to do this. It may sound silly, okay, but a few people have started doing it. Maybe me and another person came up with it simultaneously, separately. Anyway, it's really easy. There on your phone, there's a bunch of emojis, and one of them is a green heart, and that is and just green, like the heart chakra. And I know we have all kinds of different meanings for green, but if we take something and own it and kind of charge it up and sit out there and say, whenever I put a green emoji in there, or I bracket something in green emojis, I'm speaking not as my individual person towards you. I'm saying that I, as awareness, am regarding you as a valid, being and something that I hold in regard, or that I love, whatever it is. And so you can say things in one, you can also express affection in that way without it getting sticky, without it being like, oh, are you trying to come on to me? Are you trying to manipulate me? And like I said,
I never think people are trying to come on to me. It just doesn't cross my mind.
So
I'm going to have to try harder.
What I'm saying is, like, it sounds really simple, but it's just a start. It's just a start. But a few people have started doing it,
let me tell you what I heard.
It seems to work.
Yeah, what you're saying, Michael, is that if we're going to engage in genuine discourse, and we really want something enlivened and real and not necessarily productive, but what's the word? Generative.
Mhm.
That we have to do things to respect our sameness as well as our difference.
Yes,
And so
exactly.
acknowledging our shared values, acknowledging that we're part of universal consciousness, sending emojis that demonstrate that we're for each other, that somehow that has to be cultivated. Otherwise the differences
Yes.
rule the day.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's my offering. It's simple, it's kind of silly, and it's just a start. But
Yep, but it's good.
No, it's a great start. Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you, Michael.
Yeah, and
All
I
right,
like
I'm gonna have to go. I got kids, but
have to
I'm
go
gonna listen
too.
into the rest. Okay, or if you guys all got to go. But
Yeah.
I figure, are you still planning on doing this monthly? Because I will have
Yes.
more to bring.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Bye,
All
Michael.
right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, and I like the ideas of sort of introducing new signifiers into
Yeah.
conversation that can, help sort of do some of this, the heavy lifting. And I think
Yeah,
that's
when we do transformational work, we always create a container, but we
Right.
don't create a container necessarily for a conversation, but they often need them. They need ground rules, they need intentionality. We need to understand, what our rules of engagement are, you might say. Otherwise, it's just off to the races.
that's right. And I would say the only
Every game you play has to have a set of rules and a container.
That's right. That's right. And the only limitation there is that, there's only, I think, so much that we can do in terms of bringing our own interior intention and volition and, to these conversations and having more sort of authentic conversations from that space. And there's only so much good that can be generated from that when so much of the problem is actually coming systemically from, the fact that places like Facebook just are so completely flat. Places like Twitter are completely flat and all that.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think it's both. I mean, it's clearly an all quadrant problem,
Yeah.
all level problem too. Diane, do you have time for a couple other questions? Or
Yes, I do have time for a couple more.
So let's bring Sharona on. Sharona, you're being officially promoted to panelist.
Hi, Sharona.
And let me unmute you. Hello, Sharona.
Hi, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're a little quiet.
Okay, well, I'll try and speak louder. And I guess you don't have a picture, but that doesn't matter. First of all, I know it's after 4, but I mostly want to express a lot of gratitude for this discussion, for you, Corey, for creating the framework for it and bringing Diane in, who is certainly my first and one of my very powerful intro teachers. So Diane,
Thank you, Sharona. Thank you. It's good to see you. Good to hear you.
Yep. And I also am really enjoying the conversation because I kind of feel like I'm being an integral warrior out there. I'm so entirely different now than who I was before all of these practices kind of came online for me. And at a time of life, I've been kind of exploring the eldering space, and there's something very particular about this time where there's a big identity shift, where there's perhaps more available time, and the time's still very urgent. And so the ability to show up with useful tools into this space and speak into it, and speak about love and connection and creating these spaces and accepting differences and diversity and watching our own nervous systems and being able to self-manage, all of it is so important. So I really am again grateful that this is here, because it's like, as Stephen Covey says, sharpening the saw, just someplace to come to and get another integral injection of this particular medicine. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for saying so.
Thank you, Sharona.
My pleasure. So make it quick, this back and forth. Love you guys.
Love you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, that was very sweet.
Very sweet.
Yeah. You made me feel seen, Sharona. Thank you. So now we
There's
can.
a question in the chat about
Oh, yeah.
Brian Lewis, where he says, my approach is that words are important, a la Confucius taught that the recidification of words are used needs to be considered to maintain and grow a healthy society. The use of the descriptive warrior connotes conflict, bringing with me a lengthy practice of Tai Chi, which seeks the avoidance of conflict. Ideas of unity require compassion and a respect for diversity. Do you see a different descriptor other than warrior to bring into focus the ethos of compassionate teaching? Thanks, Brian. How do you say it? Rectification?
Yeah, rectification of words.
Rectification of words. I noodled on that. I considered that a little bit when Corey proposed the title. And I think in a certain way, because I'm a mediator and I'm always doing conflict resolution, and yet I myself am a fighting spirit, I think that I decided to maybe just pick it up almost as a like piece of shadow work, like to own the part of me that is a fighter, and try to ask myself, when is a fight legitimate, and what are things worth fighting for, and enduring the pain of conflict and the uncertainty and the many losses, and what is it that, I mean, it feels to me a little bit like, let's say, climate, that there are just some really big systemic changes that have to be made, and they may not happen without a fight. So I think that was my approach to the word warrior. What do you think, Corey?
No, I think I think that was beautifully stated. I think that there's a difference between sort of a seamless sense of wholeness, right? Which we can cultivate and we can carry with you with ourselves, no matter what we're doing. But that's not the same as frictionless, right? Seamless isn't quite the same as frictionless. And when we're actually bringing this out into the world, when we're trying to enact meaningful change, precisely because the world is always already perfect exactly as it is, that just creates more urgency for us to make it better and better and better and better. I think that's sort of the paradox of almost like a non-dual activism in a certain kind of way. And I think that being equipped to be able to navigate conflict, and even sometimes maybe to provoke skillful conflict where it's necessary. If we are going to, we're talking about climate change, it's going to take some fairly radical systemic changes in order for us to begin actually dealing with this problem at all, doing more than just, word service. And that's going to require a certain kind of fight. That's going to require a certain kind of tenacity. It's going to require a certain kind of political will that I think can only really be cultivated.
And sustained effort.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think in a certain kind of sense, I'm all about the peaceful warrior archetype. And I'm also, look, I've got a daughter who's got these medical, issues. And what's crazy about that is seeing how, in so many ways, how both resilient our civilization is and how fragile it is at the same time, right? So my daughter requires immunosuppression medicine to be delivered to her, which requires, her doctors at Children's Hospital to fill the prescriptions and the insurance companies to pay for it, and mail delivery systems to get it here. I mean, there's so many interlocking systems here. Any one of which goes south, the whole thing kind of crumbles down, and suddenly, my daughter's health is at risk. And it's unnerving, because you feel just how fragile this thing called civilization really is. This thing that I think for generations, my Gen X in particular, I think has been raised in a way that I think takes for granted the how solid and stable our civilization is. And I think that there's a lesson that a lot of particularly younger generations are learning, which is that civilization is something that needs to be fought for and won again and again and again, generation by generation by generation. And that means standing up for your values in as compassionate of a way as possible, doing your best to also include the values of, what you might say is your opposition in sort of a political sense or whatever, but still taking a stand and really, I think, directing your energy in a very, conscious and skillful and goal-oriented, solution-oriented sort of way, I think is becoming increasingly important, especially when we're trying to cut through all of this sort of cynicism and, almost dissociation that we often have with our civic responsibilities.
And empathy.
Yeah, and empathy, huge. And it's something that I was talking about Ken about recently, Diane, which is terrifying, I think, is that, and this was a study from 2010, I think, so almost 10 years ago, where they took these measurements and they realized that empathy is down 40% in college students than it was, I think it was like 20 years ago.
Really? Wow, that's scary.
40%. Now, what they're showing is it's not just this overall complete decline of empathy. It's that universal empathy is being transformed into a type of selective empathy.
Uh-oh.
Only, which is something that we see common in like woke culture, right? Where we are only willing to extend empathy to either the people who are in our tribe or the people who we deem to be worthy of our empathy. So, you know, this group is downtrodden because we say it's downtrodden, and therefore they're, you know, they should be subjects for your empathy. And that's, you know, obviously massively problematic. And because we're not, you know, we're becoming increasingly separated from our fellow citizens and our countrymen, and we're losing our trust in each other. We're losing sort of our cultural cohesion. We're I think really sort of losing out on the fabric of you know, what makes America so special in the first place.
Yeah, well, kind of returns to the role of training. You know, we kind of think of empathy as innate, but apparently it has to be trained to be broad in a certain way. You know, otherwise there's these ethnocentric boundaries where I'm going to basically empathize with the people like me or the ones who I feel I want to be like, but anybody that's outside of that group, I don't empathize with. So that's a really tough boundary. You know, and to actually extend it to more broadly than that and really stabilize at a world-centric level means that, you know, that you can empathize with all of humanity and all of life forms, all life in that way.
Well, and I remember too, just being a kid, you know, like growing up in the 80s, which on the one hand was like, you know, one of the most pathological decades of the 20th century, but at the same time, I mean, it was like.
What do you mean when you say pathological? What's
well, the 80s was very excessive, right? It was a very.
I see. Like you mean like the Wolf of Wall Street and.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you know, bunch of glam metal and hairspray rock, you know, all that. It was as gluttonous as our culture, I think, has probably ever gotten. Cocaine use, which is everywhere.
Yes, that's right. I remember.
You know, but at the same time, there were these emerging global values that I could feel my generation being just imprinted with. You know, we were remember the song "We Are the World"?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Remember like Hands Across America and, you know, all of these things that were really geared at helping younger generations, particularly Generation X, sort of, you know, absorb these global archetypes that the boomers were able to enjoy. I mean, you know, I often talk to Ken about how, you know, you guys were able to be the first ones to ever see that picture of Earth from space, right? That little blue marble, and how profound of an image that was, particularly for the boomer generation. And then Gen X was sort of being, you know, we were raised in the shadow of that in a certain kind of way. I mean, I remember, you know, the attitude of my teachers in high school and all that, my boomer teachers who almost had this attitude of like, well, you know, that whole civil rights thing, that whole civic and we got all that figured out in the 60s and 70s. You guys just enjoy life and, you know, consume. And I think as a result, we have an entire generation that has, you know, taken our hands off of the wheel. Even though we were trying, you know, I think there are a lot of efforts being made to sensitize us to these global values at an early age, which, you know, made me sort of a Star Trek Democrat in a certain, you know, in a certain kind of way. But I think post 9/11, I think those cultural archetypes have really, really changed. You know, we don't, if the 20th century was created between the archetypes of, you know, the blue marble in space and the mushroom cloud, right? I mean, that was sort of the big two symbols of the 20th century. We've got, you know, two burning towers and a pentagon. I mean, it's been rough in terms of the cultural archetypes that are binding rather than sort of pushing us further and further apart from each other.
I mean, evolution tends to oscillate, I think.
It really, yeah. There's always that sort of dialectic.
Yeah. So maybe time for one more question, and then we'll.
Yeah, one more. Let's talk to Jeff. Jeff Cox, bringing you over.
Hi, Jeff.
And let's get you unmuted.
Nice to see you, Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, good to see you, Diane.
Great to see you too.
I am very excited to be on this call, and I was wondering about, you know, as you know, leaving the IF training, I'm way more committed to justice and climate related issues.
Great.
And really leaning in and, you know, coming in contact with a lot of amazing organizations that are doing incredible work
Great.
And noticing that a lot of them are really at the center, green center of gravity, more or less.
Yes.
And I'm noticing this impulse inside of me to kind of like stand on the sidelines with an integral critique. And
Oh,
I'm a little bit, I'm either like really pushing my edge and jumping in and asking a lot of questions and getting like more engaged, but also I'm noticing like it's hard to identify or really feel like a sense of belonging in those organizations. And so I've been doing some shadow work, reclaiming a lot of healthy green, but I'm wondering if you have any advice for like someone who's integrally oriented, navigating green change-making spaces.
Well, it's a great question. Let me just say, first of all, Jeff, it's great to see you. And I just want to, for our listening audience to understand that I helped develop an integral facilitator program with Rebecca Colwell, and we ran it for 7 years, and she'll be continuing to do it. And I'm gradually stepping out because I'm turning my attention to climate change at this point, as you know. And I think that your question is really a departure point for a conversation, in the sense of what does it mean to have an integrally informed process or an integrally informed conversation about climate change, and is it possible, and maybe Corey can help us out with this, would it be possible for us to host one of these particular, use this particular platform as a way to start that conversation, or have a summit possibly, because I'm already starting to map out some of the things that I think are important. And what are the things, just for our purposes? So that's sort of the big answer, Jeff, is I think we're just going to have to engage and keep engaging. But what are some of the things in particular that you find yourself sort of removed from and feeling critical of, just out of curiosity?
I think the impulse to like really identify with one side of a polarity. So I can see how like when you strongly identify with one side of a polarity, it's easy to galvanize like more movement energy, because there's more clarity and it's simpler, and there's like, this is the problem, we need to abolish ICE, or like I was just got out of a meeting in Charlottesville about the refugee crisis, and talking to a gentleman who's all about abolishing ICE, and and so I just notice a lot of those organizations that are doing great work like aren't including a fuller picture, and I'm trying to feel out like, is it my own lack of willingness to like take what will inevitably be an imperfect action, or is there something calling in me to participate more fully in the conversation? So I'm kind of tracking that a little bit.
Well, knowing you, Jeff, and one of the things that I experienced with you is, first of all, you always have a lot of clarity. And when you do show up, you show up with a lot of integrity and authenticity. So it might be just starting to take some risks and sort of staying really close to the feedback, and just kind of starting to learn the territory a little bit of where you can offer an integral perspective, and where you can maybe ask a group to pick up the other side and define what's the true and partial perspective of ICE. What about that part of us that wants to preserve boundaries, and we're afraid of things changing too much, and we're afraid of losing the specifics of our culture? Like, is there room in this conversation to just for a minute look at what is right about that? Like, that would be one thing to test. Do we have the space where we can actually do that? So, but we also have to kind of develop a really good index of integral insights that can be useful in these conversations. First, second, and third person, really useful insight, using polarities rather than being fully one-sided, paying attention to energy in the room, what gives life to the room, what brings the room into wholeness, what fragments the room and creates low energy and people leave grumbling, So I think it's important for us to start to index what we consider to be the hallmarks of really good integral conversations, and then be willing to take certain kinds of risks in relationship to feedback to start to test groups that can begin to integrate some of this. Because my experience is the groups tend to remain more energized and more effective when there's more complexity, if that makes sense. How does that land?
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and also mostly I'm just feeling a lot of excitement to see, to like be connected to what you're exploring and what could be explored on this platform, and I'm definitely all in for being a part of that.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe next time I can just start to outline some of the things I've been thinking about.
That'd be awesome.
Let's do it.
Yeah, totally. Jeff, thank you so much for the question. Particularly because, I mean, that question is exactly why I feel such urgency around getting shows like these off of the ground. That was a really great question because he's asking, I've got this map. How do I actually get the rubber on the road? How do I enact this sort of in a, day-to-day way that can actually produce meaningful change, and I can make an impact in the world and all that. And I think I love how he framed the question. I love how you answered it. And most importantly, I love that we're bringing these shows online in order to give people, not only better ways to sort of understand the problem and translate, but to actually do the transformational work within themselves and in the world around them, in order to do just that. And whether that's, the work that we're going to be doing here on this show, Diane, or the work that we're going to be doing with Beena Sharma on the Polarity Wisdom show, which I think is another really, really critical sort of element here that we need to pay attention to, because what she does really well is helping people understand, is this dualism I'm looking at, is this a genuine polarity, or is there sort of a more fundamental polarity beneath the surface? And one of the ways to, I think, discern that is to determine whether or not the polarities you're working with are both either neutral or positive, or if it's like one is good and one is bad. If you're working with polarities and one is good and one is just obviously bad, that's not a real polarity, and you're not going to get a lot of,
Well, the other way to work with that, Corey, is to usually, when in my experience, polarities lots of times come with those valuations. One is good and one is bad. So what is the bad side of
That's right.
And what is the good side? So that you're really working in a way with a matrix.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. The idea being that each of these poles can have positive or negative qualities depending on whether it's integrated with its polar opposite or it's dissociated from.
Yes, exactly.
And that's where we start seeing, I think just simply doing that math, being able to do that math sort of on the spot as we're having these conversations, helps just bring a lot of clarity and really helps people feel, it helps people get more invested in the conversation, because it gives you, as sort of the facilitator of that conversation, a way to acknowledge and include the underlying core values that a person is really being animated. Now, you might disagree with the edifice. I could say, I think ice is terrible and we need to just scrap it and rebuild it from the ground up and blah, blah, blah. But if I say that in a way that does not recognize your values, and why, I might disagree with your view, but I need to include your values.
Yeah, okay. Yes, and if you're going to be in conflict, you've got to also be intimate with who I am.
That's right.
There's no way to be separate from people who are our adversaries. We're actually deeply connected.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good time for us to sign off.
I think it's perfect. And we did have one person with their hand raised. Peter, I hope you join us next time and ask your question then. We just kind of ran out of time today. But
thank you, Peter. Peter says he will. I look forward to talking to you, Peter. And also, looks like Loki, Loki. I like what you wrote also in the chat. Yeah, Corey, it's great to be with you. I have a lot to go think about right now.
Yeah, totally. And I just want to say, we were talking to Daniela earlier. She also wrote back, just in case anyone was thinking about her. She said, what you talked about, Diane, completely resonated with her. Unfortunately, she's with her little girl. She's not well, and it's midnight in Spain. So.
Oh, I hope she feels better. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. And we'll see you guys.
Thanks, Corey. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye now.